Hello, I'm David Gergen.
And I'm Ben Wattenberg.
Watergate, the resignation of Nixon, the defeat of Ford. All these shattered the dream of building a more conservative majority. Republicans were stunned. Ben, how did you see things back then?
Well, all of the above was going on, plus there was a recession. You know, there was the economy went into the tank in the fall of 1974. It lingered, and 1976 it was not yet out of it. And economics tends to trump ideology and tends to trump scandal.
Well, you know, I was in the Nixon White House during the Watergate period, and many of us felt then that Nixon's support fell away as much because of economic hard times as it did because of Watergate. And the economy really has plagued several presidents since the early 70s. Nixon, Ford, Carter, now Bush.
And now Bush. This is an economic wave he's fighting, and he may or may not be successful, but it's tough stuff.
Yeah, but back in the mid-70s, when Ford went out of office, that really did seem to stop Republicans in their tracks, building this more conservative majority.
It was definitely politicus interruptus for Republican conservatives, but it did not interrupt a move to the right, a move to the center in America generally. People tend to forget that Jimmy Carter was running at the right edge of the Democratic Party. He was the original, quotes, anti-Washington Democrat.
Yeah, but Carter, did you think he made a mistake by not governing from the right?
Oh, absolutely. As we pointed out in the earlier program, he got rolled by the liberals and aborted that move to the center by the Democrats that Bill Clinton is now trying to effectuate.
Well, let's pick up the story there, Ben, with the Carter presidency, because the failures of the Carter presidency had a major impact upon the Republican Party. If conservatives had an unwitting ally in their rise to power, it was surely the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Despite Carter's keen intellect and his success in Middle East negotiations, Democrats seemed completely unable to cope.
This situation was ripe for the conservatives, especially in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party, many of whom crossed over and were a key element of the Reagan constituency, to assert themselves.
Neoconservatives, a small but highly influential group of intellectuals, left the Democratic Party in dismay. They brought a storehouse of ideas and energy to Republicans.
I had felt that the party was veering away, moving away from me. I was somebody who very much thought that John Kennedy was right when he said we shall bear any burden and pay any price in the defense of freedom in our hemisphere. I felt that the Democrat Party, the leadership, was moving away from that.
There was available for the first time, largely due to think tanks like this one, a body of ideas that conservative politicians could turn to, respectable ideas. And I think a lot of the Reagan people did that.
A political earthquake also started on the religious right. Evangelicals had not been politically active for years, but in the 1970s, millions of them grew angry over Supreme Court decisions on abortion, school prayer and crime, over feminism and the ERA, over rights for homosexuals. Changes that struck many liberals as an expansion of personal freedoms struck evangelicals as an assault on the family and traditional values. In 1976, the evangelicals flocked to Jimmy Carter, a born-again Baptist.
They and I were heavily involved in '76. I was involved to some degree in the primary campaigns where Jimmy Carter was running in the Democratic Party. We were very excited to see somebody who said he was born again, standing for public office.
But Carter couldn't deliver. Instead of leading the nation to the sunny uplands, he seemed to be dragging it down. Inflation and unemployment exploded. Taxes seemed unbearably high. Carter embraced the Soviets, but then said he was shocked when they invaded Afghanistan. Worse yet, the nation was humiliated when a madman in Mufti held Americans hostage in Iran. Even Carter became discouraged.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
During the 4 years of malaise and confusion in Washington on a number of issues, especially the strength of our defense and our economy, the evangelicals got disenchanted. About 6 million evangelicals switched parties. It was one of the biggest shifts of allegiance maybe in American political history.
Jimmy Carter was geritol for the Republican Party, geritol for the conservative movement. It was as if Watergate gave Ronald Reagan his chance because it put a Democrat like Carter in, who then failed so demonstrably that out of his failure, you could have the election of a president conservative enough that nobody would have imagined years earlier he could ever win.
Gradually then, over a period of 15 years, from the mid-60s to the late 70s, opposition was building up all over the country to the problems of liberal rule. And the man ready, willing, and able to take advantage of the discontent was the very fellow who had lifted conservative hopes back in that Goldwater campaign of 1964.
When I first suggested the danger of government control inherent in so many federal handouts, there were people who denied vehemently that any such thing could ever take place. And yet, before too long, the same people were saying, "What's wrong with government control?" And in the recent days, we've heard representatives in the higher echelons of government ask us, "Well, are you afraid of your own government?" Well, to tell you the truth, I am. We will remind them that government programs exist at the sufferance of the American taxpayer and are paid for with money earned by working men and women, and programs that represent a waste of their money, a theft from their pocketbooks, must have that waste eliminated or that program must go.
Most people, at least at the time that the Great Society programs were enacted, thought that they were the right thing to do. They wanted government to combat poverty, they wanted government to combat racism, they wanted to take care of the elderly, all the things that the Great Society accomplished. But by the time you got to the middle of the 1970s, certainly late in the 1970s, government wasn't a force for good in the minds of just about anybody in this country except a left-wing ideological elite.
The pieces were now in place for conservatives to capture not only their party, but the White House. They had a hero, Ronald Reagan. They were brimming with fresh ideas. And they had a coalition that was building, voters discontented with the Democrats and ready for a change.
Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for a minute? Is this on? Mr. Green,
Did you turn that microphone
you
off,
asked for me if you would... I am paying for this microphone, Mr.
Reagan first had to beat some challengers in his own party. Bob Dole, John Anderson, Howard Baker, John Connally, and George Bush. They all argued Reagan was too extreme. The race soon narrowed to Bush and Reagan. Bush had spent the 70s in high-level political jobs, like UN ambassador and CIA director. Just as Rockefeller had attacked Goldwater in the 1960s, Bush now attacked Reagan as a primitive. A favorite Bush target was Reagan's passion for tax cuts.
Let me just, for the record, give you a difference that I have with Governor Reagan on taxes. It is what I call a voodoo economic policy.
But this was not 1964. The conservative moment had arrived. Reagan's conservative populism resonated with the electorate. Voters liked his appeals for cutting taxes, rebuilding defenses, and pursuing a social agenda based on old-fashioned values.
With a deep awareness of the responsibility conferred by your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
Reagan's campaign was riding a wave of history, so much so that he challenged conventional wisdom and favored a fellow Western conservative as his running mate.
Paul Laxalt was his first choice, a fellow conservative, fellow governor from the West, from the neighboring state of Nevada. People argued you couldn't have two Westerners on the ticket. Jack Kemp was the other choice, young, supply-side guru. Reagan had great affinity for him. Obviously, history would have been changed dramatically if he would have chosen one of the two men that were his first choices.
I enthusiastically support our platform.
You sort of have the sense that while George Bush never enunciated all that many positions, that when he became Reagan's running mate, he sort of lifted up that child sheet that has the cellophane on top of the slate and pulled it up and then started writing a new slate full of ideas that included things like right to life and voodoo economics and all the things he hadn't been for before.
What Bush had called voodoo, Reagan supporters call supply-side economics. It was a theory that said if taxes were cut, people would save and invest more, the economy would blossom, and tax revenues would actually grow. Supply-side economics was the heart of Reagan's domestic policy.
We're taxing ourselves into economic exhaustion and stagnation, crushing our ability and incentive to save, invest, and produce. This must stop. We must halt this fiscal self-destruction and restore sanity to our economic system.
Clearly, Ronald Reagan gave people a sense of what the future would be like if certain policies were pursued. Reagan took a conservative movement from being an opposition movement to being a far more progressive, more constructive, more positive force.
And I think that it's to Reagan's credit and the credit of the people around him that they did not simply run a campaign in 1980 based on opposition to government.
Now, so there will be no misunderstanding, it's not my intention to do away with government. It is rather to make it work with us, not over us, to stand by our side, not ride on our back. Government can and must provide opportunity, not smother it. Foster productivity, not stifle it. Some 30 minutes ago, the planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free.
The day Reagan was inaugurated, American hostages came home from Iran. It was an auspicious beginning for a presidency that soon became the stuff of legends. Two months after the inauguration, a young man with a gun almost took Reagan's life. A tragic moment, but also a turning point for his presidency. Suddenly, Reagan was more than just likable. For a lot of Americans, he also became a symbol of courage, a man who took a bullet with a smile. Coming out of the hospital, he seized the opportunity for leadership.
The budgetary actions taken by the Congress over the next few days will determine how we respond to the message of last November 4th. That message was very simple. Our government is too big and it spends too much.
A Democratic Congress had to agree, and by August enacted huge tax and spending cuts into law. That same summer brought another turning point. The nation's air traffic controllers went on strike in violation of the law.
And if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
Once the head of a union himself, Reagan eventually fired 11,000 skilled workers. In less than a year then, Reagan had acquired immense power and set a wave of new ideas into motion. Conservatives argue they brought the longest period of economic growth in our peacetime history. Critics say the Reagan years were an economic blowout and have thrown us into hard times today.
There is a bear in the woods. Some people say the bear is tame. Others say it's vicious and dangerous. Since no one can really be sure who's right, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Ironically, the man who came into office as a novice in foreign affairs left his most positive legacy there. Reagan believed, when almost no one else did, that the Soviet Empire was headed for the scrap heap of history. He was determined to hasten its collapse by fostering democratic movements around the world. Clearly, there were mistakes and excesses. 241 Marines sent to Beirut for unclear purpose were killed by terrorists.
Congress is to blame because of the fickle, vacillating, unpredictable, on-again, off-again policy toward the Nicaraguan democratic resistance.
The Iran-Contra scandal was the administration's most troubled moment. The White House said it was acting out of the best of motives, but laws were ignored, laws were broken.
Early this morning, forces from 6 Caribbean democracies and the United States began a landing on the island of Grenada in the Eastern Caribbean.
Reagan usually acted decisively and swiftly, with many successes. He overthrew a small communist coup in Grenada. He ordered an airstrike into Libya, a haven for terrorists. He thwarted worldwide terrorism.
Launched a series of strikes against the headquarters that support Muammar Gaddafi's subversive activities.
Most remarkable of all was his belief that democratic capitalism, if just given a chance, would defeat Soviet communism. Reagan saw around history's corner.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
To rebuild America's defense is part of a careful long-term plan to make America strong again after too many years of neglect and mistakes.
Reagan led a huge arms buildup to challenge the Soviet Empire. Reagan's most radical idea was in nuclear arms, to erect a defensive shield for the United States, the so-called Star Wars defense. Even some top Republicans thought Star Wars was too fanciful, that Reagan was too ignorant to grasp the complexities of international affairs. As it turned out, they were wrong. Men who have talked to Gorbachev say he became convinced that the Soviets couldn't keep up with America and sued for peace. The Cold War was coming to an end.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work.
Heading into the 1984 elections, Reagan was unbeatable. The country was standing tall overseas, and at home it climbed out of recession. Americans rewarded Reagan with one of the biggest landslide victories in history, and conservatism was very much in the saddle. But thoughtful Republicans saw that under the surface, economic troubles were building up.
I think that we largely succeeded in the 1980s in doing what we said we were going to do, which was to engender economic growth for a long period of time. We did not succeed in holding down spending, and hence the deficit grew, and that is a problem.
I recall in 1981 sitting in a Republican caucus with the view universally expressed that Ronald Reagan was so popular, the Democrats in the House feared him so much, we had control of the United States Senate, that this was the time to reasonably take on middle-class entitlements, not to hurt people. We weren't going to inflict a great deal of pain, but to do some fundamentally important things which now are being talked about, $3.5 trillion later.
We could endlessly debate whether the 80s were a positive or a negative. I happen to think it was very positive with regard to showing that entrepreneurial capitalism can create jobs and get the economy growing again without inflation.
The 80s did bring a dramatic increase in jobs. Nearly 19 million were created. Small business flourished. Many of the nation's biggest manufacturers retooled and became much more competitive. The economy grew steadily for most of the Reagan years. Yet another side to the 80s cannot be ignored. Huge, stable corporations went on a binge of mergers and breakups. And then Black Monday. The stock market collapsed in October '87, shattering confidence in the country's economic future. In their streets, Americans saw more and more homeless families, drugs passing at street corners, children shot down from passing cars. While in the boardrooms, greed seemed to engulf some of the nation's biggest names. Michael Milken went to jail. Charlie Keating went to jail. Hundreds of savings and loans went under, and taxpayers had to pay the bill. Everybody knew the next president would have a tough job, all the tougher because Reagan was such a hard act to follow. As he left office, he was still a beloved figure.
We lit a prairie fire a few years back. Those flames were fed by passionate ideas and convictions. Together we fought for causes we love, but we can never let the fire go out or quit the fight, because the battle is never over. But I want you to know that if the fire's ever dim, I'll leave my phone number and address behind just in case you need a foot soldier.
As George Bush took over the party in 1988, there were already cracks in the Republican coalition. He moved quickly to assure conservatives and the country that he would be tough enough to follow Reagan.
Congress will push me to raise taxes and I'll say no. And they'll push and I'll say no, and they'll push again and I'll say to them, read my lips, no new taxes.
I think he was never totally comfortable with the Reagan economic policies, and I think he took the tax pledge in 1988 not because he believed you shouldn't raise taxes, otherwise he never would have raised taxes. I think he took the tax pledge because it was a New Hampshire primary and he'd been beaten by Bob Dole in Iowa, and he saw it, and his political people advised him it was the only way you can stay in the game.
But Bush was also anxious to put his own stamp on the party, and he sent signals that he would soon depart from Reaganism.
Where is it written that we must act if we do not care, as if we're not moved? Well, I am moved. I want a kinder and gentler nation, that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
As he has for a quarter of a century, George Bush embodies the very tensions that rage within the Republican Party, between the rawhide conservatism of a Reagan and the more moderate views of the establishment.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Reagan came to office with a vision, a strategy for change. Bush is different by his very nature. He came to be a good steward, to be on call if fire bells go off in the night. During the Bush years, the Soviet Empire collapsed, perhaps the biggest single event of our lifetimes. With Bush leadership, coalition forces drove Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. The President and Secretary of State Jim Baker even brought Arabs, Israelis, and Palestinians to the negotiating table.
The President has been phenomenal in the area of foreign affairs. He has done a superb job, and he'll be remembered in his first term for that. In the area of the economy, I regret to say that I do not believe that the White House economic team ever really grasped the seriousness of this recession.
I'm not prepared to say we are in recession when you have a growth, a third quarter growth of 2.4%. It's not vigorous growth. It is not the kind of growth that I'd like to see the United States have, but it is not recession.
I think that it's been unfortunate for George Bush that he has been made the whipping post on the economy for having violated the truths of Ronald Reagan, when in point of fact, an awful lot of his problems come from being the guy who was there when the Reagan bubble burst.
It was not some liberal Democrat who declared, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then broke his word to cut a seedy backroom deal. Have you all seen this newspaper by any chance?
As the 1992 primary campaign began, conservative frustration with the president boiled over.
This recession and this sluggish recovery, according to everyone that I speak to, is fundamentally linked to the size of this deficit, the amount of money that we're spending on interest, close to $200 billion this year. You know, there was a time when government could do things to turn it around and to get the economy moving and to prime the pump. We don't have that money today.
Maybe it was voodoo economics. Whatever it was, we are now in deep voodoo, I'll tell you that.
Ross Perot, in his early months, split away millions of Republican voters who were unhappy with Bush and not yet ready for Bill Clinton. Perot gave them a way station. Even as the economy stalled, problems here at home were dramatically underscored this summer by riots in Los Angeles. In retrospect, the Republican coalition built up in the 70s and 80s may have depended on good times to keep it together. With harder times in the 90s and Reagan gone, the coalition has begun to unravel.
The conservative coalition was held together primarily, I would argue, by its economic policy, a view of economic growth and activism on the economy. If that is not sort of the core that goes through our coalition and our party, then you have a lot of tensions and a lot of arguments that have not been fully resolved.
I think the tensions are with the middle of the Republican Party and the right. What you saw at the convention in Houston really was the dominance of the religious right over that of the what I would call mainstream Republicans. I don't believe that the average delegate to the Republican Party was nearly as conservative as either the platform reflected or as the speeches would indicate.
There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America.
If the Republican Party is becoming a party of people who have fundamental religious beliefs, that's not the party that I'm going to belong to. I'm going to make sure this party represents a lot more than that, even though I'll be out of the Senate.
To me and to most Republicans, traditional values start with faith in Almighty God. And that is why we do not take God out of the Republican Party platform.
The Jewish people have their movements, and the Catholic people have theirs, and the women have theirs, and the homosexuals have theirs, and labor has theirs, and the manufacturers have theirs. Everybody's got their own little special interest group.
I think the takeover of the party by the fundamentalist right has to be resisted. And I think what we have to do is to welcome people of all beliefs, but we ought not to be establishing a religious party as such, an exclusionary party, one that builds upon hate or divisiveness as opposed to inclusion and hopefulness.
Optimistic Republicans say the best hope for the party's future is a more optimistic vision for the country, the kind often expressed by Reagan and economic conservatives.
But when people have a stake in the system, they'll not only defend their own property, they'll help their neighbor defend his property as well. You see, this is the message of Los Angeles. This is the message of every other pocket of poverty in America. We must be the party that gives all people a stake in the system and a stake in each other. People are beginning to question conservatism because we've got a deficit, we've got a slow growth economy, we've got problems that abound, and frankly, conservatives have not yet shown that they understand the necessities of government. Government should be responsible for a safety net under which people should not be allowed to fall, but it should be equally or more responsible for building a ladder of opportunity upon which all people can climb.
Entrepreneurial capitalism has to be the centerpiece of our approach to the economy and to society. It's important not just as an economic policy, but as a social policy. I mean, in this election in which we're talking about change, the one thing that's missing is a coherent Republican explanation of how a capitalistic economy produces greater social change than anything that we can do through the government. Keep what we've built during the Reagan years. Keep the Republican Party as the party of international leadership. Keep the Republican Party as the party of economic growth. But give real meaning to this concept, to a Republican concept of activist government. It still is the challenge that is out there for George Bush and for the Republican Party and for the conservative movement.
Here's what I'm fighting for. Open markets for American products, lower government spending, tax relief, opportunities for small business, legal and health reform, job training, and new schools built on competition ready for the 21st century.
And so there we have it, a Republican Party that only a few years ago enjoyed a huge majority now finds that its coalition is cracking. It struggles to keep the White House. It worries about a religious war within its own ranks. And yet, Ben, I find within this Republican Party still a positive vision that could be very popular in the future. It's a vision of economic growth, of a country that remains competitive internationally, of a government that works more effectively to empower people and emphasize traditional values. Thank you for joining us.
I'm Ben Wattenberg.
And I'm David Gergen.